At exactly 6:42 p.m., halfway through my uncle's toast, my mother raised her glass and said the sentence that rewrote my entire childhood. "It's time you forgave him." The reunion hall froze. Cutlery stalled mid-air, a baby's cry stuttered into silence, even the humming generator outside felt suddenly distant. In that instant, the 100 relatives in the room blurred into background noise. Only 3 figures remained in focus: my mother, glowing with the confidence of someone about to fix everything, my uncle Tund, staring too hard at his plate, and me, pinned under the weight of a forgiveness I had never agreed to give. My heart slammed against my ribs so loudly I almost missed her next words. "It's been what, 12 years? We are family. Life is too short to hold on to the past." Her voice poured through the speakers, warm and reasonable, like she was inviting everyone into a prayer, not dragging me toward a public execution. Polite laughter fluttered and died. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Some cousins avoided my eyes, others stole quick glances at me, then away, as if looking too long would make them complicit. 1 or 2 raised their phones, already recording, just in case this turned into a moment. From where I sat, the long tables looked like courtroom benches. My aunties at the front became a row of judges, their brightly colored gillies like stern crowns. At the far end, teenagers who barely knew the story whispered and giggled, sensing drama without understanding its cost. I sat in the center of it all, the accused without a lawyer, called to witness against myself in a case everyone else had already decided. The smell of jollof rice and fried meat mixed with my nausea, turning my stomach. I wrapped my fingers around my glass so tightly the condensation made my palm slick. 1 droplet slid down the side, carving a path through the fog, and I followed it with my eyes just to avoid meeting anyone else's. Behind the clinking plates and fake smiles, the old memory stirred, slow at first, then sharp and fast. 14 years old. My father's angry voice. My mother's silence. My uncle's calm, righteous face. The night they taught me that in this family, truth is not what happened. Truth is what the adults agree to say out loud. Back then, it started with something tender: trust. I was 14, too tall, too quiet, too eager to be good. In a home where affection was measured and words were rationed, my uncle was the loud, generous exception. He called me professor, slipped me extra money for snacks, asked about my day when everyone else was too tired or too busy to care. "You can tell me anything," he said one evening, leaning on the balcony railing beside me. "I'm on your side." I believed him. I believed him so completely that when I started talking to someone online, when I had questions I couldn't ask my parents, I confided in him. I let him hold my secrets because I thought his hands were safe. The betrayal happened in 3 brutal steps. First, the discovery I never saw coming: my father in the living room, my phone in his hand, his thumb flicking through my private messages. My heart dropped into my stomach before I even heard his voice. Second, the public reading. He paced the room, quoting my words like accusations. Every line that had felt vulnerable and honest in my chest now echoed as evidence of my recklessness. My mother sat on the edge of the sofa, eyes fixed on a stain on the floor, as if she could disappear into it. Third, the verdict: "This is your fault for being careless," my father said. "Your uncle was only trying to help. He showed me because he loves you." The room spun. No one asked how my uncle had gotten access to my chats. No one wondered why a grown man had been scrolling through a teenage girl's phone for her own good. They decided the narrative, stamped it, and filed it away. That night, when the house finally fell quiet, I went looking for my uncle. My hand shook. My throat burned with words I didn't know how to say without being called rude. I found him in the corridor, scrolling on his own phone, relaxed as if he hadn't just detonated my world. "Why did you do it?" I asked. My voice sounded small to my own ears. He looked up, smiled, and pulled me into a half-hug I did not want. "You'll thank me one day," he said. "They needed to know what you were doing. I saved you from yourself." Saved me. The word scratched at my skin from the inside. By morning, the story was set. He was the protector, I was the foolish child. The betrayal had been repackaged as a favor. And I learned the rule that would stay with me for years. In this family, if an adult calls it love, you are not allowed to call it harm. Back in the hall, my mother continued as if reading from a well-rehearsed speech. She has grown, she announced proudly. She's mature now. She knows holding on to anger only hurts her. Her hand landed on my shoulder in a gentle squeeze, presenting me like a finished product, a before and after testimonial of her parenting. Around us, heads nodded along. A few people murmured agreement, their faces soft with relief. They loved this version of events. There was a problem, there was time, now there is healing. Clean. Simple. No messy details. My grandfather struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. The room fell into a respectful hush. My children, he said, voice rough with age and history, this matter is already in the past. In this family, we do not keep records of wrongs. We forgive. We move on. His words carried the weight of war stories and survival, of sacrifices I couldn't fully understand. Under that weight, my pain felt embarrassingly small, like a scratch complaining beside an old scar. Yet inside, it throbbed like a fresh wound. I wanted to ask him, how do we move on from something we never truly looked at? As more elders chimed in, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer just a dinner, it was a ceremony. My forgiveness had become the evening's main event. The MC brightened, smelling content. Ihen. Today, Old Walla will end, he crowed into the microphone. Laughter rippled through the room. My mother turned toward me fully now, arm outstretched. Come, she said softly but firmly. Let's end this today. Go and hug your uncle. Let the devil be ashamed. To them, this was spiritual warfare. To me, it was emotional blackmail dressed up as holiness. The room pulsed with expectation. Little cousins craned their necks. Aunties leaned forward, their bangles tinkling as they shifted. The younger ones, who only knew rumors about that thing that happened years ago, were wide-eyed with anticipation. They smelled drama and deliverance, and they wanted both. If I refused, I knew how quickly the story would twist. I would become the child who disgraced her mother in public, the one who refused peace, the girl who still held grudges after all these years. If I complied, I would be applauded, filmed, praised for my maturity, at the cost of betraying myself again. Either way, I would bleed. The only question was, where? Before I could move, my uncle pushed his chair back and rose slowly. He smoothed his shirt, adjusted his expression into something soft and noble. The MC drifted closer, extending the microphone like a royal scepter. 2 phones were already up, cameras trained on his face. My dear, he began, his voice dipped in gentle sorrow, you know I love you. I never meant to hurt you. I was only thinking of your future. Everything I did because I care. He did not say what he did. He did not name it. He did not mention going through my messages, handing them over, standing aside while I was humiliated. Instead, he carefully built the same old story, I am the protector. You misunderstood. The room melted under the warmth of his tone. Auntie Bose, who always had an opinion, raised her voice from the second row. You see, she declared. He has humbled himself. What more do you want? A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others nodded harder, as if agreeing more strongly could make everything simpler. The question sank its claws into me. What more do you want? As if asking for truth made me greedy. As if wanting someone to say, what I did was wrong, was too much. I wanted to shout that I didn't want groveling or punishment. I wanted clarity. Ownership. Reality. But the more I looked around, the clearer it became, they didn't want reality. They wanted a happy ending. Amid the pressure, something small and fragile sparked inside me. For a moment, my mother's expression faltered. Her eyes, glossy with determination, flickered with something else, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. My younger cousin slid closer and brushed her fingers against my arm, whispering, "Are you okay?" Even my grandfather's gaze shifted. His brows drew together, his lips pressed thin. For a heartbeat, it felt like the room might tilt in another direction, like someone might actually ask, "What do you need?" That tiny possibility, the idea that my story might finally be heard, lit a stubborn little flame in my chest. In my mind, the scene rewrote itself. The MC handed me the mic first. My mother turned to me and said, "Tell us what happened, from your side." My uncle's shoulders dropped, his mask fell, and he said the words I had never heard, "I betrayed your trust." In that imagined circle, there were no performances, no phones. Just people, listening. Just my voice, shaking but free. For a few seconds, that fantasy was so vivid I almost believed it. It was enough to straighten my back, to steady my breathing. I realized then, no one was going to hand me that version. If I wanted even a piece of it, I had to take it. The noise in the hall faded to a low hum. I became acutely aware of my own body, the weight of my feet on the floor, the tightness in my chest, the glass still in my hand. For years, I had told myself that staying quiet was safer. That silence was the only way to stay in the family without tearing it apart. But in that moment, surrounded by people willing to edit my life into an uplifting speech, something shifted. I understood that silence was not neutral. Silence was consent. Every time I swallowed the truth, I signed my name at the bottom of their version of the story. My hand loosened. I set the glass down. Just as I opened my mouth, my sister leaned in, face smiling for the cameras, voice sharp for my ears alone. "Please don't start," she hissed. "Don't spoil this day for Mum." There it was. The real threat. Not my uncle, not my parents, not even the elders. The real threat was the idea that my honesty was dangerous. That my pain was a bomb, and if I let it go off, it would destroy everything. Meanwhile, what he did to me was treated like a minor fire that had already gone out. On stage, the MC laughed into the microphone. "Ehen, we are about to witness serious reconciliation, oh," he joked. The word reconciliation twisted in my gut. You cannot reconcile a story that has never been told truthfully. Something inside me clicked into place. A quiet, unshakable no. Not this time. Not like this. Before anyone could react, I stepped forward and reached for the microphone in the MC's hand. His eyes widened, but he let me take it. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The music, which had been playing softly beneath everything, faded into irrelevance. For the first time that night, all those eyes were on me because of something I had chosen to do, not something being done to me. I lifted the mic, feeling its weight. My voice, when it came, surprised me with how steady it sounded. "They asked me to forgive him," I said slowly, letting each word land, "but nobody here has asked me how." The sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into deep water. The ripples were immediate. My uncle's practiced smile cracked. My mother's fingers tightened around her glass until I feared it would shatter. Some relatives shifted in their chairs, suddenly fascinated by the tablecloth. Others stared at me with something like fear. For the first time, it wasn't about whether I would forgive. It was about what they had never bothered to know. I turned, looking from face to face, my grandfather, my aunties, my cousins, my parents. "Before you all decide what happens next," I continued, "you're going to hear what happened first. From me." The room went beyond quiet. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I could sense the panic under some of the calm faces. If I told the full story now, their neat narrative would crack. Their hero would look less like a savior and more like a man who broke a child's trust. Their memories of what happened back then would struggle against the reality coming out of my mouth. But for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for their discomfort. My only responsibility was to the girl I had been, the one who had been told to be grateful for her own betrayal. I drew in a breath, feeling 12 years of swallowed words rising, finally, to the surface. 12 years ago, I began, The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the entire hall dropped into darkness. Gasps and nervous laughter erupted. Someone's phone flashlight clicked on, then another, scattering weak cones of light through the room. Voices overlapped, complaints about NEPA, calls for the generator, jokes about bad timing. In that patchwork darkness, surrounded by shifting shadows and half-lit faces, I stood there with the mic still in my hand and a strange calm settling over me. The moment had not gone the way they planned. The performance had been interrupted. And even though I hadn't yet told the whole story, one unchangeable thing hung in the air like a crack in a wall. They could still pretend not to know what happened, but from this night on, they would never again be able to say they didn't know I had something to say.